"This is ridiculous," Alexander Pierce muttered, swirling the 30-year-old scotch in his crystal tumbler. From his penthouse office on the 87th floor, San Francisco's skyline sparkled like scattered diamonds against the twilight sky, a view that had long since lost its ability to impress him. At 42, he'd accumulated more wealth than most people could dream of, built Pierce Technologies into a $50 billion empire, and grown thoroughly tired of people's predictable nature. The latest Forbes magazine lay open on his desk, his own face staring back at him from the cover. "America's most eligible billionaire, the man who has everything but love." The headline made him scoff. Love was just another commodity, something people traded for security, status, or comfort. He'd seen it happen countless times, beautiful women throwing themselves at him, their practiced smiles barely concealing their calculations. Still brooding over that article, Alex Richard Chen's voice cut through his thoughts. His board member and longest-standing friend, if you could call any business relationship friendship, stood in the doorway, an amused smile playing on his lips. Just contemplating how predictable people are, Richard Alexander set down his glass. "Every relationship, every interaction, it's all just transaction. People want something from me, always. The bigger the bank account, the more transparent their motives become." Richard crossed the room, his Italian leather shoes silent against the plush carpet. "Perhaps you're just looking in the wrong places. Not everyone is as conventionally motivated as the women you usually date." "Please," Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Show me one person in this city who'd want me for something other than my money or status. One person who'd see past the Pierce Technologies empire." A dangerous glint appeared in Richard's eyes, the same look he got before closing a particularly challenging deal. "Care to put your money where your mouth is." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A bet," Richard said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing Alexander's desk. 1 year of marriage to someone who doesn't fit your usual parameters, someone who society wouldn't expect you to choose, no supermodels, no socialites, no influencers, and the stakes. If I'm right, if you find genuine connection possible, you make me CEO of Pierce Technologies' new AI division. If you're right, and it's all just transaction, Richard paused for effect, I'll sign over my 15% stake in the company to you. Alexander leaned forward, suddenly interested. He'd been trying to get Richard's shares for years, consolidate his control over the company. "You're that confident?" "I even have someone in mind," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "My sister's friend, Sarah. Brilliant data scientist, pioneering work in AI ethics. But she's not your typical Silicon Valley trophy wife material. No Instagram model looks, shall we say." Alexander studied the photo Richard showed him. The woman was heavy-set, with a round face and plain features. In the picture, she was giving a presentation, her hands animated, eyes bright with passion behind thick, rimmed glasses. She was exactly the opposite of everyone's expectations for a billionaire's wife. A slow smile spread across Alexander's face. 1 year, and all I have to do is marry her and prove there's no such thing as genuine connection. "That's right," Richard extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Alexander grasped it firmly, already calculating the positive PR this would generate. The caring billionaire, looking past appearances, a modern fairy tale. And at the end, he'd have both Richard's shares and proof of his cynical worldview. Deal. Deal. Neither man noticed the city lights dimming outside, casting long shadows across the office like outstretched fingers of fate, reaching toward a future neither of them could predict. Sarah Chen's fingers flew across her keyboard, lines of code reflecting in her glasses as she worked late into the evening at the AI Ethics Institute. The lab was quiet except for the gentle hum of servers and the occasional whir of the ancient coffee maker in the corner. At 35, she'd earned her place as one of the leading voices in ethical AI development, even if the tech world wasn't always ready to listen to someone who looked like her. Dr. Chen, her assistant's voice startled her from her focus. "There's someone here to see you." Sarah glanced at the time, 8:45 p.m. "I don't have any appointments this late." "It's Alexander Pierce." The name hung in the air like static electricity. Everyone in Silicon Valley knew Alexander Pierce, the tech wunderkind who'd transformed social media with his groundbreaking AI algorithms. Sarah had critiqued some of his company's ethical practices in her recent papers. "Send him in," she said. quickly smoothing her rumpled cardigan and running a hand through her shoulder-length black hair, a futile attempt at professionalism after 14 hours of coding. He strode in like he owned the building, and for all she knew, maybe he did, impeccable in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Sarah felt every extra pound, every imperfection magnified under his scrutiny. She'd spent a lifetime being judged for her appearance, from the childhood taunts of fatty, fatty, fatty to the subtle dismissals at tech conferences where she was often mistaken for support staff rather than a keynote speaker. Dr. Chen, he smiled, extending his hand. Your paper on algorithmic bias in facial recognition software was illuminating. Sarah blinked in surprise. She'd expected a confrontation about her criticisms, not praise. You've read my work. I make it a point to know my critics, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, especially the brilliant ones. The compliment felt strange, out of place. Men like Alexander Pierce didn't notice women like her, except to dismiss their ideas. She'd learned that lesson early, back in high school, when the popular boy had asked her to the prom, a cruel joke that had left her hiding in the bathroom while her classmates laughed. College had been better, focused on minds rather than appearances, but the tech world had its own subtle ways of reminding her she didn't fit the mold. What can I do for you, Mr. Pierce? She asked, keeping her voice professional, detached. Please call me Alexander. He leaned forward, his cologne subtle but expensive. I'm here to offer you a partnership. Your ethical framework combined with Pierce Technologies' resources, we could revolutionize AI development. Sarah's heart raced, but not from attraction. This was her life's work, the chance to implement real change. You're serious? Completely. Have dinner with me tomorrow. We can discuss the details. That dinner led to another, and another. Alexander was attentive, interested in her ideas, seemingly unbothered by the stares they received in expensive restaurants. Sarah found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone about: the eating disorders in college, the therapist who'd helped her find self-acceptance, her dreams of creating AI systems that recognized the beauty in human diversity. You're different, he told her one evening, as they walked through Golden Gate Park. Not caught up in the Silicon Valley superficiality. Sarah laughed, but it held a trace of bitterness. Easy to avoid when you're never invited to those circles. Their loss, he said, taking her hand. The gesture felt rehearsed, but Sarah pushed the thought away. She'd spent her life analyzing data, finding patterns, but sometimes patterns could blind you to exceptions. What she couldn't see was Alexander's mental calculations, how their public appearances were already shifting his company's image, how her brilliant mind could benefit his AI development, how perfect this all was for winning the bet. Every smile, every touch, every seemingly vulnerable moment was logged and evaluated for its strategic value. But there was one variable he hadn't accounted for: the way Sarah's passion for ethics was beginning to make him question his own algorithms, how her determination to be judged for her mind rather than her appearance was subtly shifting his perspectives. Like the butterfly effect in chaos theory, tiny changes were beginning to cascade through his carefully ordered worldview. In her lab late one night, after everyone else had gone home, Sarah stared at her reflection in the darkened monitor. The old insecurities whispered, he's Alexander Pierce, and you're you. But then she straightened her shoulders, remembering the girl who'd survived worse than heartbreak, who'd built herself into someone whose ideas could change the world. Don't overthink it, she told her reflection. Focus on the work. But as she turned back to her code, she couldn't quite silence the hope blooming in her chest, dangerous, wonderful hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally seeing her for who she was rather than what she looked like. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, Alexander added another note to his private journal. Day 47, subject continues to demonstrate exceptional intellectual capacity. Integration into Pierce Technologies proceeding according to schedule. Richard's shares nearly secured. He ignored the small voice, wondering why he'd caught himself smiling at one of her terrible science puns earlier that day, or why he'd actually looked forward to their dinner. Those reactions weren't part of the plan. They weren't part of the equation at all. The proposal came on a Tuesday evening, in Sarah's lab of all places. Alexander arrived with his usual precision timing, but something seemed different: a slight tension in his shoulders, a carefully controlled energy in his movements. Marry me, he said, without preamble, holding out a ring that could have funded her research for a decade. Sarah's hands froze over her keyboard. What? I've never met anyone like you, Alexander continued, his words polished as corporate PR. Your brilliance, your perspective on AI ethics, it's exactly what Pierce Technologies needs. What I need. Sarah stared at the ring, then at him, her analytical mind racing. This is sudden 3 months of dating, and now this? Alexander, people like you don't marry people like me. That's exactly why it makes sense, he pressed on. We could change the face of tech together, challenge stereotypes. Think of the impact we could have. It sounded more like a merger proposal than a declaration of love, but Sarah had learned to speak the language of tech billionaires. Perhaps this was his way of expressing genuine feelings. Still, the media will tear us apart, she said quietly. They'll say I trapped you, or that you're having a breakdown. Let them talk, he took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger before she could properly answer. We'll prove them all wrong. She didn't say yes, exactly, but she didn't say no either. The media explosion was nuclear. Tech billionaire's shocking engagement screamed the headlines. Social media erupted with cruel memes and skeptical hot takes. Photos of them together were everywhere, always with the same angle, the handsome billionaire and his plus-sized fiancée, analyzed and dissected like a scientific anomaly. Pierce Technologies stock drops 5% following CEO's engagement announcement. Who is Sarah Chen? The unconventional woman who captured a billionaire's heart. Friends worry Pierce suffering mental breakdown. Sarah stopped reading the news. She threw herself into her work, into wedding preparations that felt more like preparing for a corporate merger. Alexander handled the press with practiced ease, spinning their story into a modern fairy tale about looking beyond appearances. The wedding was a media circus. Sarah wore a custom Vera Wang that made her feel simultaneously like a princess and an imposter. Alexander was perfect, camera ready, saying all the right things. His hand never left hers during the reception, but she noticed it tensed whenever another cruel tweet was whispered about among the guests. Early married life was strange. They moved into Alexander's penthouse, where Sarah set up a home office. Their conversations revolved around AI ethics, company strategy, public appearances carefully choreographed to show their perfect relationship. Alexander was attentive, considerate even, but something felt calculated about his affection. You're living every woman's dream, her mother told her during their weekly calls. A handsome billionaire who loves you for your mind. But did he? Sarah caught him sometimes, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride? Calculation? Regret? Their first public interview as a married couple was with Time magazine. The journalist was skilled, probing. What attracted you to Sarah? She asked Alexander. Her brilliant mind, he answered smoothly. Her revolutionary ideas about AI ethics. Beauty comes in many forms. Sarah smiled for the cameras, played her part. But later that night, alone in their massive bedroom, Alexander often worked late. She stood before the mirror in her practical cotton pajamas. What are we doing? She whispered to her reflection. The next morning, she found Alexander had already left for the office. On the kitchen counter was a note in his precise handwriting: early board meeting. Don't forget we have the charity gala tonight. The Puerto Rico team will send your dress and stylist by 3 p.m. Sarah made her coffee, started her workday, tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. She was changing the face of AI ethics, challenging beauty standards, living a life she'd never imagined possible. So why did it sometimes feel like she was just another algorithm in Alexander's perfectly coded world? In his office, Alexander was updating his private journal, day 127 of marriage. Public perception improving. Company stock recovered. Subjects AI ethics implementations showing unexpected positive results. He paused, cursor blinking. For the first time, typing subject instead of Sarah felt wrong somehow. He deleted the entry without saving it. The first crack in Alexander's carefully constructed facade appeared during a late-night coding session. Sarah had been working on implementing her ethical frameworks into Pierce Technologies' core AI systems, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she explained her logic. See, your current algorithm favors conventional beauty standards in image recognition. But beauty isn't binary, it's cultural, contextual, deeply personal. By broadening the parameters, she paused, noticing Alexander's intense stare. What? "You just identified a bias I've been blind to for years," he said softly, and for once, the calculated smoothness was gone from his voice. "How do you do that? See things so clearly?" Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the genuine admiration in his tone. When you spend your life being judged by narrow standards, you learn to question them. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a flicker of guilt. But it vanished so quickly Sarah thought she'd imagined it. They worked through the night, ordering Chinese takeout, their shoulders touching as they debugged code together. It felt real, natural, unlike their carefully orchestrated public appearances. Weeks passed, and Alexander found himself increasingly drawn into Sarah's world of ethical innovation. Her compassion wasn't just theoretical, it transformed everything she touched. When their AI team presented a new facial recognition system, she didn't just identify potential biases, she helped them understand why those biases mattered. "It's not just about algorithms," she explained during a board meeting, her passion cutting through the corporate sterility. "Every line of code we write affects real people, real lives. We have a responsibility to get this right." Alexander watched her command the room, saw his hardened board members lean forward, engaged. She wasn't just changing their technology, she was changing their perspective. Changing his perspective. The journal entries he'd been keeping about their marriage grew less frequent, less clinical. How could he reduce their interactions to data points when she kept surprising him? Like the night she found him struggling with a childhood memory of his father's disappointment, and instead of offering practiced sympathy, she challenged him to examine why he still let that pain drive his decisions. "You built an empire to prove him wrong," she said, curled up beside him on their balcony. "But what do you want to build for yourself?" The question haunted him. What did he want? The bet with Richard had seemed so straightforward months ago, a business transaction dressed up as marriage. But now, they started having real dinners together, not just public appearances. Sarah introduced him to her favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurants, places where his money meant nothing and the food meant everything. She laughed at his attempt to use chopsticks, taught him the proper way to eat xiaolongbao without burning his tongue. "You've got to let the steam out first," she demonstrated, expertly poking the dumpling. "Sometimes the best things require patience." The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Their shared passion for technology evolved into genuine intellectual partnership. Sarah's ethical frameworks weren't just making their AI better, they were making it more human. Together, they began developing systems that could recognize and respond to emotional nuance, that understood beauty in all its diverse forms. But with each breakthrough, each genuine moment of connection, the weight of his deception grew heavier. The bet loomed like a shadow over every real smile, every honest laugh, every time he found himself reaching for her hand, not for the cameras, but because he wanted to. One evening, he found himself alone in his office, staring at the contract he and Richard had drawn up. The stakes seemed trivial now, the motivation hollow. He opened his journal, intending to make another entry, but instead found himself writing. "Sarah helped me understand today why our AI kept misidentifying emotions in certain facial expressions. You can't categorize human feelings like spreadsheet data," she said. "There's always nuance, context, history." She was talking about the algorithm. But she could have been talking about us. About me. What started as a simple equation has become, I don't know what it's become. And that terrifies me. He closed the journal without finishing the entry. Down the hall, he could hear Sarah in their home office, probably working late again on their latest project. Her humming drifted through the door. She always hummed when she was deep in thought, a habit he'd found annoying at first, but now. Alexander loosened his tie, feeling like it was choking him. The man who'd made that bet months ago wouldn't recognize him now. That man had believed in simple transactions, in relationships that could be quantified and controlled. That man hadn't known Sarah, really known her. "Everything okay?" Sarah's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, concern evident in her eyes. "You've been quiet all evening." "Just thinking about the ethical implications of our new emotion recognition system," he lied smoothly, hating how easily the deception came. "Amen." She didn't look convinced. "Well, when you're ready to talk about what's really bothering you, I'm here." That was Sarah, always seeing through facades, even his. Especially his. As she turned to leave, Alexander felt the words rising in his throat. It was all a lie. A bet. "I never meant to," but he swallowed them back, coward that he was. Instead, he watched her walk away, the weight of truth pressing against his chest like a stone. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He'd set out to prove that genuine connection was impossible, only to find it and then destroy it with his own deception. In the silent office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Alexander Pierce finally admitted to himself what he'd been denying for weeks: he was falling in love with his wife. And that realization terrified him more than any business challenge ever had. The truth unraveled on their 6-month anniversary, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a misplaced tablet. Sarah had been looking for financial projections in Alexander's home office when she found his personal journal, synced automatically to the device. The first entry caught her eye: day 1 of the bet. Richard's terms accepted. 1 year of marriage to secure 15% stake. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through entry after entry: clinical observations of their relationship, calculations of PR value, notes on her usefulness to the company. The room spun. Every moment, every touch, every seemingly genuine connection, all carefully orchestrated for a business transaction. Alexander found her there an hour later, the tablet still in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "It was all a game to you," she said quietly, her voice eerily calm. "A bet. A corporate takeover dressed up as marriage." "Sarah, I can explain." Explain what? Her voice cracked. "How you and Richard traded my life, my feelings, my reputation for company shares. How you documented my emotional responses like I was one of our AI experiments." Alexander stepped forward, but she backed away. "It started that way, yes, but things changed." "Did they?" Sarah's laugh was hollow. "Or did you just get better at playing your role? Let me guess, falling in love with the fat, ugly woman would make for an even better PR story, wouldn't it?" "That's not." "I believed you." She cut him off. "God, I actually believed that someone like you could see past, could see me. Do you have any idea what it's like to finally feel accepted, valued, only to learn it was all a lie?" Alexander watched helplessly as she paced the room, her carefully built confidence crumbling. This wasn't like their practiced public appearances or staged photos. This was raw, real pain he had caused. "The ethical AI frameworks," she whispered. "Were they just part of the game too?" "No. Your work is brilliant, revolutionary." "Stop." She slammed her hand on his desk. "Stop treating me like an asset to be evaluated. I'm a person, Alexander. A human being who was stupid enough to think." She choked back a sob. The sight of her breaking down shattered something in Alexander. All his carefully constructed justifications, his rational explanations, crumbled in the face of her pain. He saw with sudden, devastating clarity what he'd done, not to an experimental subject or a business opportunity, but to a woman who had trusted him, who had shared her vulnerabilities, her dreams, her brilliant mind. "I'll have my things out by morning," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "You can spin this however you want for the media. Heaven knows you're good at that." "Sarah, please." He reached for her hand, but she jerked away. "Don't touch me. You've gotten what you wanted, haven't you? Proof that relationships are just transactions. Well, congratulations. You've proven your point." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You know what the saddest part is? I was starting to think when you looked at me lately, it felt real. I actually thought." She shook her head. "I guess I'm still that naive girl believing in fairy tales." As she walked away, Alexander felt panic rising in his chest, not the calculated concern he'd shown for cameras, but genuine, gut-wrenching fear. He was losing her. Not the asset, not the brilliant mind that had revolutionized his company's AI, but Sarah with her terrible science puns and her passion for ethical technology and her ability to see through everyone's facades but his. "Sarah, wait," he called out. "You're right, I'm a fraud, a manipulator, everything you think, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being an act. I fell." "Don't." She cut him off, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare say you fell in love with me. I couldn't bear another lie." The door closed behind her with a quiet click, so much worse than a slam. Alexander stood alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, and realized that for all his billions, all his careful calculations, he'd just lost the only thing that had ever really mattered. In the corner, his tablet still displayed the journal entries, the clinical documentation of his greatest deception and his greatest mistake. With trembling fingers, he picked it up and read his own words through new eyes, seeing not a clever business strategy, but the systematic destruction of something genuine, something precious. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Pierce, the man who had built an empire on controlling outcomes, had no idea how to fix what he had broken. I stand before you today, not as the CEO of Pierce Technologies, but as a man who has failed spectacularly at being human. Alexander's voice echoed through the packed auditorium. The emergency shareholders' meeting had turned into a media event, with cameras broadcasting his unscripted confession worldwide. 6 months ago, I entered into a marriage based on a better callous, arrogant wager that treated a brilliant woman's heart as a corporate asset. His hands gripped the podium. That woman is Dr. Sarah Chen, and she deserves better than the lies I built around her. In her small apartment across the city, Sarah watched the live stream, her throat tight. She'd spent the past week rebuilding her walls, throwing herself into independent research, ignoring the media circus that had erupted when she'd moved out of the penthouse. The truth is, Alexander continued, his polished facade cracking, I set out to prove that love was impossible, that every relationship was just a transaction. Instead, I learned that I was the one incapable of recognizing real value when I had it. Dr. Chen's brilliance transformed our AI systems. But more importantly, her humanity transformed me, not that I deserved it. Social media exploded. Pierce's confession trended worldwide. But for once, Alexander wasn't monitoring the public reaction. His eyes sought out Richard in the crowd. The bet is void. Richard Chen retains his shares, and his voice wavered. I forfeit any right to claim victory in a game that should never have been played. Sarah's phone lit up with messages from colleagues, friends, media outlets. She ignored them all, lost in memory of quiet nights coding together, genuine laughter over bad takeout, moments that had felt real because, perhaps, they had been. Meanwhile, Alexander wasn't finished. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Pierce Technologies. Dr. Chen's ethical frameworks will remain the foundation of our AI development. With full credit and compensation for her innovations, the company will establish a $100 million foundation dedicated to promoting diversity in tech, focusing on those who've been overlooked or undervalued because they don't fit conventional expectations. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found her voice in a different way. She published a searing article about tech culture, beauty standards, and the commodification of human connection. It went viral not for the scandal, but for its raw honesty and call for genuine change. We build artificial intelligence while failing at authentic humanity, she wrote. We chase algorithms for beauty while missing the elegance in our differences. I entered a fairy tale twisted by Silicon Valley's distorted mirror, but I emerged with this truth: my worth was never determined by a billionaire's validation or society's standards. Her inbox filled with messages from people sharing similar stories, particularly women in tech who'd felt invisible, underestimated, defined by appearance rather than ability. Sarah started a podcast, Beautiful Variables, discussing ethics in tech and the human cost of bias. 3 months after the confession, Alexander attended one of her public lectures. He sat in the back, watching as she commanded the room with confidence that needed no external validation. Her message about ethical AI had evolved into something more personal, more powerful. We're teaching machines to recognize patterns, she told the audience, but perhaps we should first examine the patterns we've internalized. Every time we accept bias as normal, every time we reduce human complexity to simple transactions, we diminish not just others, but ourselves. She saw him as she left the stage. Their eyes met briefly, no cameras, no pretense, no bets. Just two people who had stumbled through deception into truth. Your work on the Ethical AI Foundation, she said quietly. It's making a real difference. It's your vision, he replied. I just provided the resources I should have given freely from the start. The silence between them held a novel's worth of words. Finally, Sarah spoke. For all your data analysis, you missed the most important variable. Oh. That real change in AI, in people, in relationships can't be calculated or controlled. It has to be lived, mistakes and all. She turned to leave, then paused. The Garden Cafe on Harrison Street. Saturday, 10 a.m. If you're interested in discussing ethical AI implementation. Just discussion, no bets, no games. I'll be there, Alexander said softly, watching her walk away, not as the woman he'd once seen as a means to an end, but as herself, brilliant, beautiful in ways his former self had been too blind to see, and completely free from the need for his or anyone else's validation. Around them, the tech world was shifting, ever so slightly, as their story sparked conversations about worth, authenticity, and the true measure of success. Sometimes it turned out the biggest disruptions in Silicon Valley had nothing to do with technology at all. 1 year to the day after their first meeting, Sarah and Alexander sat together in her old lab, surrounded by lines of code and endless possibilities. Not as CEO and employee, not as husband and wife, but as partners in something larger than themselves. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to her screen, where their latest AI project was running. "The system is now recognizing beauty across all body types, ages and ethnicities with nearly perfect accuracy. No more bias toward conventional standards." Alexander leaned in, not just playing the role of interested executive, but genuinely absorbed. "You did it. You actually rewrote the definition of beauty for artificial intelligence." "We did it," she corrected him. "Your willingness to publicly acknowledge the biases in tech, to make real changes. It opened doors I couldn't have opened alone." The past few months had seen them slowly rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. Their weekly cafe meetings to discuss ethical AI had gradually evolved into deeper discussions about their own transformation. Alexander had shown her his continuing therapy sessions, his genuine efforts to unlearn toxic patterns. Sarah had shared her journey of self-discovery, how losing everything had ultimately helped her find her strongest self. The Foundation's latest report came in, Alexander said, pulling up the document. Over 500 scholarships awarded to unconventional candidates in tech. The recipients' innovations are already challenging industry norms. Sarah smiled, remembering her own journey. Sometimes the best disruption comes from those who don't fit the pattern. "You taught me that," he said softly. Among other things. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of their shared history hung between them. Then Sarah's computer beeped another successful test of their new AI model. "The system's ready for implementation," she announced. "Every major tech company using our framework will now have AI that sees beauty in all its forms." Alexander stood, walking to the window where the San Francisco skyline sparkled, the same view he'd once looked at with such cynicism. "You know, I spent years thinking I could quantify everything. Success, beauty, love, all just variables in an equation. And now I know that the most valuable things can't be calculated." He turned back to her. "Sarah, I know we can never go back to what we were, and maybe we shouldn't. But moving forward, would you consider partnering with me? Professionally," he added quickly. "Your vision, my resources, working together to change the industry's perspective on beauty and worth." Sarah considered him thoughtfully. The arrogant billionaire who'd once seen her as a bet was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to see value in all its forms. And she was no longer the woman seeking validation. She'd found her own worth, independent of anyone's approval. "Partners," she agreed, extending her hand. "On one condition." "Name it." "We make this bigger than just tech. Schools, media, anywhere people are told they don't fit the right pattern, we change the pattern." Alexander grasped her hand, the gesture simple but sincere. "Deal. No betting this time." As they turned back to their work, the lines of code reflecting in their screens, they understood that their greatest innovation wasn't in the AI they'd created, but in the perspective they'd changed. In an industry obsessed with surface perfection, they'd found something deeper: the beauty in transformation, the value of authentic connection, and the power of seeing people really seeing them for who they are. The sun set over Silicon Valley, casting long shadows through the lab windows, but this time they weren't reaching toward an uncertain future, but toward endless possibilities for change.